기자부대 Hamon the beat!
From the start, my channel has always been focused on JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and really that's no surprise since JoJo is easily my favorite manga series and I've been really deeply invested in it for about a decade now. If you only know me from YouTube, you only get a glimpse of this, but I'm interested in a wide variety of other things as well. So to celebrate reaching 300,000 subscribers on YouTube, I'd like to take a look away from JoJo for a moment to talk about all the other things I'm passionate about. Now for this video, I'm mostly going to stick to talking about series I like instead of just individual things. I guess to start, we could stay within the realm of anime and manga to talk about some of those series that I enjoy the most. One of these is of course One Piece, which I started reading back in 2021, around the time JoJolion had ended. I caught up to the manga around the end of Wano and I've been reading it weekly ever since. One Piece is really the first big shonen series I've gone all the way through other than JoJo, and I absolutely loved it, with it now being one of my all-time favorite manga. On Twitter I've posted a tier list of my favorite arcs, although I feel like there were never really any low points and I pretty much enjoyed everything from beginning to now. If I had to pick a favorite character, it would have to be Chopper. After I read his arc, I almost immediately started buying up any Chopper stuff I could find, and I've put together a decent-sized collection of him as well as other One Piece figures. While I've read the entire manga, I haven't actually watched much of the anime. The pacing of it is somewhat off-putting, and having already read the story, I can't really imagine watching it more stretched out. However, I can see myself watching the upcoming remake as it releases. I also did watch all of the One Piece movies, with movie 6 being by far my favorite. I actually made a video a little while ago where I thought about making One Piece videos. Some people were definitely interested in the idea, and every now and then people pop up asking if I'll ever make them. I'm still torn on it since with JoJo I had already been a fan of it for some time and knew almost everything about the series by the time I started making serious videos on it. With One Piece, I've just read through it one time, so I feel like I don't have a real grasp on everything yet. And if I make videos on it, I'd like to try to avoid just repeating what other YouTubers say about it and provide my own real perspective. So while I definitely would like to make some videos on it, I'm still not sure exactly what I would cover, and I don't yet feel like I have the knowledge base necessary for it. That, and I've heard that Toei copyright is pretty strict, and I'm not sure how that would affect it as well. Something else I love are the works of Naoki Urasawa, mainly his 4 most acclaimed works, Monster, Pluto, 20th Century Boys, and Billy Bat. I read all 4 of these back to back and was blown away by the detail put into the storytelling. I think Monster is my favorite overall, and it's such a powerful story. I think Urasawa is really a master of storytelling, and the actual act of reading his manga is something you have to experience, since the choices he makes of what to reveal with each new page are just perfect. One of the best things about Urasawa's manga for me are the endings, which from what I've seen is actually a controversial opinion. Many people you'll find online actually hate the way that he ends his stories, but I have to disagree. Obviously I won't show any of the endings here, but one thing about them is that they stick in your mind and you won't stop thinking about them for months after you finish reading. The main way I would describe his style of endings is that I believe each of his stories revolves around a single question, and I think that each manga spends its entire length unraveling that question until you finally get that answer at the very end. So oftentimes you're left with these shocking endings that drop some kind of bombshell answer on you, and rather than waste time afterwards, he just ends it right there. And I think that's part of what makes them so effective. Hopefully if you've read some of his manga, you can understand exactly what I'm talking about. If not, then I would absolutely recommend that you read or watch Monster, and then look into his other stories. One thing to note is that his manga have only begun to be digitized very recently, so to get an official translation for many of them, you have to buy the physical books or read fan-translated scans online. This wouldn't be a big deal, but for 20th Century Boys in particular, it is, since the fan translation is actually an older version of the manga. 20th Century Boys and its epilogue manga, 21st Century Boys, were later redone in what's called the Perfect Edition, and these are the versions you'll find on store shelves today. For 21st Century Boys, the ending is actually fleshed out with a few more pages added that I think are incredibly important. So if you read this manga, I recommend at least buying 21st Century Boys on its own so you get the best experience with that ending. Another one that may need some added context is Pluto. This manga is actually an adaptation of a story arc from the original Astro Boy manga. You don't need to read it before or anything, since Pluto is very different and mostly focuses on a different character. I say just having an awareness of what Astro Boy is good enough here. Pluto also recently got its long-awaited anime adaptation on Netflix, which I hear is very good. Other than those things, I recommend going into his manga as blind as possible, since one of his best talents is the constant suspense and surprises you'll find in his stories. I still need to get into some of his older manga and his current one, Asadora, but for now I can at least recommend you check out those 4 masterpieces. I mentioned Astro Boy a second ago, which brings us to my next recommendation, which are the extended works of Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka is one of the single most prolific mangaka in history, and I haven't touched a vast majority of his work. However, what I have read has never failed to surprise me. I guess I assumed since Tezuka was so early and influential in the manga industry that his stories would tend to be more basic or generic. But that couldn't be further from the truth, and the stories that Tezuka tells are actually shockingly creative. My main recommendation here is Blackjack, one of his later series and one that's largely considered his second best behind Astro Boy. It's about a black market doctor who deals with a series of strange diseases. If I had to compare it to something, I would actually say it's a lot like House, but of course a lot more fantastical and cartoonish. Funnily enough, those two have actually crossed over in a commercial advertising a DVD of House's Japanese dub. Like Urasawa, I think Tezuka has an extreme talent for storytelling and how to end a story. Each chapter is pretty much standalone, and the places he chooses to end those stories are often shocking and really stick with you. I don't want to give them away, so I recommend just reading them. Blackjack has also gotten some adaptations, and while I've heard very good things about the OVA series, I have yet to check it out completely. It also recently got a TV drama special with Issei Takahashi playing Blackjack, the same actor that plays Rohan in his TV drama. Obviously, his other big manga is Astro Boy, which I first checked out after finishing Pluto. Again, I kind of assumed Astro Boy would be more of a generic sci-fi manga since Pluto is sort of held up as the serious and more complex version of it. But I think that's being unfair to Tezuka since Astro Boy actually deals with a lot of interesting and mature themes in a way that's very surprising for an older manga. Now, it is harder to recommend the manga here since it's presented in a very odd way. There are no fan translations of the original manga here, only the official English version. However, the manga is presented from left to right like an American comic, and the chapters are also not presented in the original order. This is an order Tezuka selected for when the manga was republished, but it does lead to confusion by having certain characters like Adam's family popping in and out since you don't get their introductions until later. Regardless, since the stories are mostly standalone, you can still read it this way without much issue. Astro Boy, of course, has some anime adaptations, and the 2003 anime series is actually extremely well done. It is one of the last TV anime to use cell animation, and combined with a high budget, it actually ends up looking movie quality a lot of the time. It's a different but good reinterpretation of the story, so I recommend getting familiar with both the manga and the anime. Tezuka, of course, has a long history of other works that I have yet to get into, but I have also heard very good things about Dororo, Barbara, and Phoenix, just to name a few. Something I also recommend checking out is the Manben episode focused on Tezuka. This is a series created by Naoki Urasawa where he interviews manga creators and shows their drawing process. There was an episode about Tezuka where he met with 3 of Tezuka's assistants and they discussed his career. I found it totally fascinating, especially the segment where they show one of his old calendars which is packed with deadlines, showing that he was working on 6 different series at this time, finishing a total of 266 pages in 1 month. One of his assistants says something very interesting here that I agree with, that Tezuka's themes are diverse and his readership is vast. His body of work covers practically all genres and demographics, from shonen to shoujo to seinen, so I find his work very easy to recommend. You can pretty much approach it from any angle you want and find something you'll enjoy, so I hope you do the same. Moving on from that, we also have another very old bit of Japanese pop culture, tokusatsu TV shows, and in particular, Kamen Rider and the other works of Shotaro Ishinomori. He's practically the godfather of these types of shows, and on top of that, he was an influential mangaka around the same time as Tezuka. Most American viewers are probably familiar with Power Rangers, which is based on Super Sentai, another Ishinomori creation. Kamen Rider came first though, with the main difference being that it mostly focused on a single character instead of a team of rangers. The original version of the story is about a man who is kidnapped by the evil organization Shocker and transformed into Kamen Rider, but then he escapes and fights them. Of course, it's a typical superhero kind of show, but I love the presentation of it. The 1970s special effects are charming, but also genuinely impressive at times, and nothing can really stand in for the stunt work you'll see in it. Kamen Rider has been going on for over 50 years now, with nearly as many different incarnations. These are split up into 3 distinct eras. The Showa era going until the 90s, the Heisei era covering the 2000s and 2010s, and the current Reiwa era. Now, I haven't seen every Kamen Rider show, but I do know that most are standalone, especially the newer ones. Personally, I am a fan of the older ones, and in their case, they actually follow a bit of continuity with other characters making guest appearances. I highly recommend you check out the original 1971 series, at least for the first 10 or so episodes. After that point, the tone of the show changes a bit after the original actor, Hiroshi Fujioka, had a motorcycle accident. So this is when they introduce a second Kamen Rider to take his place. This is the point where the show figures out its formula, and it establishes a lot of what would come in later series. The original main character makes his full return as the protagonist around episode 70 or so and up until the finale. That original 10 episodes is still my favorite of this series, which I would recommend for anyone, since it has a darker tone and a different presentation with the main actor doing his own stunts. I enjoyed the whole series though, and I say if you enjoy those original episodes, you'll definitely have fun with the rest, as well as many of the sequels that came after it. The original show is actually really easy to find since you can watch it for free off of Tubi. With the sequels though, you'll have to probably do some digging through fan subs. While there is some continuity, these shows are mostly standalone as well. They each focus on a new protagonist and group of characters, while the mentor character Tachibana keeps returning to help. The old protagonists also come back in guest appearances. I highly recommend any of these, but my personal favorite is Amazon, which feels a lot different from the others by having a unique Tarzan-like protagonist and also being more violent. It's also one of the shortest of these shows, only being about 24 episodes. I'd also recommend checking out the Shin Kamen Rider movie directed by Hideaki Anno. It's a reinterpretation of the original show, and it works well for both fans of the original and people trying to get into the series. I'd especially recommend watching the first 10 episodes of the original and the movie to compare the two. Another good entry point would be with Kamen Rider Black from 1987. Unlike the previous era of shows, this one was a sort of soft reboot with all new characters. They went all out with this show, and it is pretty much the highest production value you'll find in this era, and it looks good all the way through. This one is also unique for being the only show with a direct sequel, Kamen Rider Black RX, which I also enjoy. The next best place to start is with the first series of the Heisei era, Kamen Rider Kuga. This one is yet another soft reboot and works great as a standalone show. If you prefer a more modern feeling show, this is a good choice, and it redefined the series for this new era. It's a very nice story with a fantastic protagonist that I recommend a lot. Something I really like about it that sets it apart is that it is very focused on the characters instead of just action. And there are often times where the main character doesn't even transform for the majority of the runtime. I'd also highly recommend the show that came after it, Agito, which feels like a much more refined version of this type of show. The general consensus with the series is that you can just jump into any show that you want, since most of them do not cross over with each other outside of movies. The only exception would be shows like Decade and Zio, which were like anniversary seasons that brought back a ton of old characters. So I recommend checking out any of the ones that look interesting to you, but I do hope you consider looking at the ones I listed, which are my personal favorites. Now, the fandom of Kamen Rider is pretty big, and I expect that a good amount of people watching are at least familiar with it, if not already fans. So I want to also put a spotlight on something related to it that I feel doesn't get nearly enough attention. That being the Toei Fushigi comedy series, as well as other tokusatsu sitcoms created by Ishinomori. Really, it's exactly what it sounds like, old Japanese sitcoms, which often have some kind of costumed or puppet mascot character. I first discovered these when I was getting into Kamen Rider when episodes of them were uploaded on the official Toei Tokusatsu World channel. For a while they were posting individual episodes of Kamen Rider shows which I was looking at when I stumbled upon some of the strange series they had posted on here. Here you can find the first 2 episodes of each of these shows with subtitles. The oldest one of these is Robocon, a 1974 series about a robot that moves in with a Japanese family to try and help them. But he often ends up destroying stuff around the house when he helps. This show ran for 118 episodes and later received a reboot in 1999 that ran for 51. Any of my viewers in Arabic-speaking countries might actually recognize Robocon, since the 90s reboot version received an Arabic dub and aired on Spacetoon. Unfortunately, as far as an English translation is concerned, to my knowledge we only have subs for the first 2 episodes of the 2 shows, as well as ones for the Robocon movie. In Japan, Robocon is viewed as one of the classic TV figures like Kamen Rider or Ultraman, but English tokusatsu fans unfortunately don't seem to know much about it. Robocon is pretty much the basis for everything that came after in the Fushigi Comedy series. This was a TV block that ran from 1981 to 1993. Outside of the ones I'll be talking about in a minute, this series also had shows like Masked Poitrine, which is said to have been one of the inspirations behind Sailor Moon and other magical girl series. One of the ones I really enjoyed was Pitonton, which is actually the first of these that I ever saw. It's pretty much the Japanese version of E.T. and is about a green alien creature that moves in with a family. Then we have my personal favorite, Dokinsho Nemulin, which is about a pink fairy named Nemulin that is woken up from an 800 million year slumber by a young girl and then moves into her house and generally causes havoc. I'm sort of underselling these with just a synopsis, but the main thing I want to get across is that while it may sound like a generic premise, the contents of these shows are actually insane. The tone is a lot different from what I expected since it isn't just a cheery kids show, it actually has some darker adult humor mixed in, and sometimes the characters are hilariously sarcastic or rude to each other. One example would be the second episode of Nemulin where the parents get fed up with her antics and try to kick her out, so they pretend that they're too poor to afford keeping her there and will have to commit suicide if they go into debt. Other episodes also have ridiculous premises, like the 16th episode where Nemulin tries to stop a war between sentient ice cream and meat buns. I can't properly describe the show with just words, so I recommend you check out the episodes which are free on YouTube. Beyond those 2, Nemulin also has a few more episodes with fan translations, and I think it's a genuinely hilarious show. The Fushigi Comedy series also has some sort of follow-ups to Robocon, which are just more shows with similar robot characters. One of these shows, Baten Robomaru, is actually the only one of these to have a full English translation. Unfortunately, the rest have no such luck, and with most of them having hardly anything outside of the 2 YouTube episodes. Nemulin does have that handful of extra episodes translated, but that project seems to have been long abandoned. If you're curious to learn more about the Fushigi Comedy series, I recommend checking out the video going over it by Mercury Falcon. He delves into the history behind each of these shows and the many that I didn't cover here. He is also currently working on a video entirely focused on Robocon, which I'm looking forward to. The main thing I want to do here is just share the existence of these shows and get people to check them out since they are genuinely very funny. It's a shame since for Kamen Rider and Super Sentai there are so many dedicated fans that almost every bit of content is translated for it, but this other part of Japanese TV history is unfortunately missing with seemingly nobody willing to translate them. Hopefully if more people do see them, there's a chance that they could be translated one day, so if you check them out, let me know what you think in the comments. For the last couple topics, I'd like to move on to video games. One of the biggest game series I've come to like the most in recent years is the Yakuza or Like a Dragon series. Just volume-wise, this is one of the most prolific game series there is, and it's had entries coming out almost annually for about 20 years now. I feel like there's a big overlap between JoJo and Yakuza fans, so I imagine a lot of the people watching are already quite familiar with it. I had been aware of the series for some time, but I first really got into it around 2015 thanks to the Yakuza Your Next Favorite video by Hyperbit Hero, who, as an aside, is one of my all-time favorite YouTubers when it comes to recommending more niche games. And it really was niche back then, since that was around the time that Yakuza 0 was about to release in Japan and the series was nearly dead in the West. A lot of people now might not know this, but the Yakuza games used to take a very long time to release in English, and with Yakuza 5 things got so dire that it didn't come out until 3 years after as a digital-only release. That's in stark contrast to how things are today with Yakuza 0 getting so popular after being ported to Steam, and now we're seeing simultaneous worldwide releases for the series. Most fans now probably got into Yakuza through 0 and the Kiwamis, but I actually got my start with the PS2 original, which back then could only be played in English with the dub. I actually really liked the game regardless, and in 2020 I finally played Yakuza 2, which to this day is my favorite in the series. Nowadays, you can actually play a patched version of Yakuza 1 with the Japanese voices and an improved translation, as well as a similar patch for 2's translation. While 0 is an easy entry point for a lot of people, I actually don't completely recommend starting there. 0 originally released between 5 and 6, and I think you're meant to have some knowledge of the series already going in. Yakuza 0 is one of my favorite games, and part of the reason for that is how well it builds on what was already there in the original games. I feel like to really appreciate the past that we get in that game, you need to know how things will turn out in the present. I actually think people should try to start with the original 2 and go from there, since I feel like it's the best starting point thematically, and gameplay-wise, the series evolves instead of jumping back and forth between eras and engines, like what happens when you go through the Kiwami games. I'm also not a fan of some of the changes that came with the remakes, which for Yakuza 2 especially affect the great tone that game had. Hyperbit Hero also has a video on this subject, which is really great and shows how the PS2 games had a lot of unique charm that was lost, and they're definitely still worth playing. I haven't played every Yakuza game yet, but I just recently finished up Lost Judgment, and I'm still looking to play some of the spin-offs like Ishin and Dead Souls. But I am caught up on the main series, and I'm definitely excited to try out the new Majima game. One of the main things I appreciate about the series is how grounded it is. That might sound wrong since the series definitely has its fantastical moments, but what I mean is that the setting is very well established, with you returning to the same cities throughout the series and seeing small changes it goes through throughout the years, as well as seeing all the characters grow and change over time. I just can't think of any other game series that lets you see a world and characters evolve like this. If I had to choose my absolute favorites from the series, it would probably be the original Yakuza 2, Yakuza 0, and Yakuza 7. Yakuza 2 really refines the combat from the first game, and it ends up having one of the most snappy and responsive combat systems that even some later games failed to live up to. It also introduced some of my favorite characters from the series like Sayama and Daigo. It's really been overshadowed by its own remake in recent years, but there's still so much to enjoy about the original game that sets it apart, especially since Kiwami 2 even removes some content. For Yakuza 0, like I said, it's a really strong prequel with the way it utilizes so many of the series' early characters, and it ends up telling a really nice focused story. I think with some of the games prior, like 4 and 5, there just got to be so many characters and moving pieces that the stories got more convoluted and some individual parts of it suffer. Yakuza 0 dialed back the scope by just having the 2 main stories, and I think it was very tasteful how they prevented the 2 from directly crossing over. Finally, for Yakuza 7, I was honestly blown away by just how great of a story they managed to tell immediately after the end of the Kiryu saga. Ichiban is a magnetic character that you can't help but fall in love with, and the cast of side characters is one of the strongest they've had in the series. I also really enjoyed the game's take on turn-based combat, and I feel like it translated really well to this series. A lot of people were confused by the idea, but I've always seen the games as RPGs to begin with, and simply switching the style of battle doesn't take away from the series' identity. 7's gameplay has a couple rough edges that Infinite Wealth greatly improves on, but I think 7 was a stronger story overall, and it's one of the endings that I always find myself thinking about after playing. In the future, I actually would like to make some videos on the Yakuza series since these games are just so unique and have a lot of underappreciated aspects. I've already planned some out that you'll hopefully be interested in watching in the future, so if that's something you'd like to see me do, tell me your thoughts in the comments. Lastly, I want to give a spotlight to some of my personal favorite games, the Kill the Past series from Grasshopper Manufacturer and Suda51. A lot of people watching are probably familiar with the more popular games from Grasshopper like No More Heroes, which is included in this list. What I'm mainly talking about though are the original games from the studio that started with their visual novel The Silver Case in 1999. I've actually mentioned The Silver Case on my channel before in one of the JoJo Fun Facts videos since the game contained a couple references to JoJo. It's a pretty niche title that I expect most people aren't familiar with. No More Heroes is actually set in the same continuity as the earlier Grasshopper games, and this group of games shares a lot of characters and themes. In particular, they have the shared theme of confronting and overcoming your past, which is why fans of these games have come to refer to them as the Kill the Past series. Now, I was never really interested in visual novels, but The Silver Case has an extremely unique style and presentation that I haven't seen any other game match. It isn't a traditional visual novel and has some moments of moving around and interacting with the environment, and the actual presentation of the story is with this very interesting mixed media style that combines 2D art and 3D elements as well as live action footage. The story is mainly about a group of detectives called the Heinous Crimes Unit, which operate in an alternate history where the Kanto region of Japan has become its own independent metropolis state. It's focused on the re-emergence of the notorious serial killer Kamui Uehara, who one of the main characters had arrested 20 years prior. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, and it eventually delves into the nature of crime and policing and the conspiracy behind the planning of the dystopian city the game takes place in. The story itself is just fascinating, and it has some of the best writing I've seen in a game. It also has some really entertaining dialogue, and the tone ranges from funny to terrifying depending on the moment. The game is split between two stories called Transmitter and Placebo. The Transmitter side is basically the main plot of the game, focused on the heinous crimes unit and the silent protagonist that you name. The Placebo stories follow the journalist Tokyo Morishima, who is working in the background and investigating the game's events. He's almost the polar opposite of the silent protagonist in the other half, and the majority of this story is seen through Tokyo's inner monologue. It's recommended that you play the chapters in sequential order, so each Transmitter followed by the corresponding Placebo, since the Placebo story often explains a lot of what happened in the last chapter. Both stories have a lot of shocking twists and turns, and I really want people to experience that too. It's on Steam and it goes on sale frequently, so I definitely recommend looking into it. After the Silver Case, there's also a number of games that Suda directed which are connected to it. Flower, Sun, and Rain was a game that released for the PS2 in 2001 and which got a re-release on the DS. This one is a 3D adventure game which follows the searcher named Sumio Mondo, who is hired to stop a terrorist attack on an island resort. Initially, the game seems like it has nothing to do with the Silver Case, but it eventually becomes very clear that it's a sequel, so it's recommended that you play it after. For playing in English, the DS version is the only option at the moment, but it is easy to emulate. This game in particular is also one of my favorites for having some of the funniest writing I've encountered in a game. It has a lot of Twin Peaks influence with a strange cast of characters, and I really love the island setting. The gameplay is also very unique. It's mostly focused on solving puzzles by inputting numbers you'll find by reading an in-game book. One of the game's running jokes is how the protagonist is constantly being inconvenienced and keeps running into new things that get in the way of his job. So he'll be sent on these wild goose chases which end up with him walking across the island solving the inhabitants' minor problems. So the thing that actually takes up most of your time in this game is walking long distances. Now obviously that sounds annoying, and on some level it is, but it's intentionally so, and a lot of the time it makes for a hilarious payoff. The story of the game itself is something I can't quite describe without spoiling it completely, so I recommend going in as blind as possible after the Silver Case, since by the end it turns out to be a really emotional story. Then we have the 25th Ward, which is like a more traditional sequel to the Silver Case and has the same style of gameplay. This one is set some years after in a new portion of the city named the 25th Ward. This sequel is basically the first game turned up to 11 with an even bigger cast of characters and a more convoluted story. I can't really get into it without spoiling the first game, but it feels like the culmination of everything before that point. This one also features multiple stories, this time with 3 interweaving narratives. The game actually originated as a mobile phone game released episodically starting in 2005. It eventually stopped being available and was considered lost media for a time until it was remade in 2018. It's also available on Steam alongside the Silver Case. The games have beautiful art from multiple artists, but mainly Takashi Miyamoto, who has a wonderfully unique and expressive way of drawing people. All 3 of these games have fantastic soundtracks. The Silver Case's composer is Masafumi Takada, who has gone on to work for the Danganronpa series. Outside of that trilogy, we also have Killer 7, first released on the GameCube in 2005 and later ported to PC. This was a collaboration between Grasshopper and Capcom, with the legendary Shinji Mikami working as the co-writer. Killer 7 is a totally different type of game compared to the others, with it being a sort of hybrid adventure game and first-person shooter, and I'd even say it has survival horror elements as well. It's focused on a group of assassins called the Killer 7, which work for the US government. This is another story steeped in conspiracy and politics, and I think has some very interesting things to say about the nature of conflict in the world. The game also has a gorgeous cel-shaded style, as well as great direction and voice acting. The game was initially planned to feature more characters from the previous Grasshopper games, but much of it was ultimately cut. It is still connected in some ways I won't spoil, but it also works as a totally standalone story that I think everyone should experience. Lastly, we have No More Heroes, a series of hack-and-slash action games starring an otaku assassin, Travis Touchdown. These are by and large the most recognizable games Suda and Grasshopper have produced, and that's not really a surprise since they really are great. The original game released on the Wii in 2007 and became something of a cult classic, getting a direct sequel 2 years later. The original game is my personal favorite of the series, and it can be enjoyed totally on its own. Later we got the spin-off Travis Strikes Again in 2019, which I would actually consider one of the most important games in the series. This was Suda's first return to writing and directing a game in over a decade, and in many ways it's him meditating on his whole career. While the first two No More Heroes games are mostly standalone, Travis Strikes Again directly brings Killer 7 and Silver Case characters into the mix and establishes No More Heroes as taking place in the same world. A couple years later, we finally got the proper third entry, No More Heroes 3, which I also really enjoyed and believe is pretty underrated. I'm a huge fan of Suda's games, and I think all of them have excellent stories that are worth playing. The fanbase for these games is still quite niche, but something I've noticed for series like JoJo is that one of the most important things for people to have is a dedicated and detailed fan wiki. These wikis are some of the first things that appear when you search for the characters, and I think it's important for them to act like reliable places where you can find all kinds of information on them. There is a fandom.com wiki for Suda51's games, as well as a standalone No More Heroes one. However, both are practically abandoned and contain next to no information about some of the most important games from this series. So I decided to create my own wiki at killthepastwiki.com. I officially got it online in August of this year, and it has a number of comprehensive pages for the series' characters and games. I've had fun writing for it, but there's still a ton to add, like many of the Killer 7 and No More Heroes pages. The site has finally started to appear on Google results, so hopefully it will start reaching more fans of the games. If you are a fan of these games, or if this video convinced you to check them out, then you're welcome to help out on the wiki in any way you can, or just simply enjoy what's written on it. As a huge fan of these games, I'm hoping to spread them to as many people as possible, so hopefully at least some of you learned about them from this video. I'm pretty invested in sharing the love of these games around, so if you have a question about these games or which ones to play, feel free to ask me since I've come to learn a lot about them. And that's about everything I have to talk about today. Obviously, there are many more things that I like other than what I mentioned in this video, but here I tried to mostly stick to large series that I'd have a lot to say about. If you're curious about other things I might like, you can also check out my pages on my anime list, Letterboxd, or Backlogged, where I list out and rate everything in detail. I think this video was a good opportunity to show off some of the things I love and hopefully introduce new people to them. I also think it's a good way to potentially test the waters for new videos. I'll always be making videos about JoJo since that's what I'm most passionate about, but I'd also like to hear about what other kinds of videos my viewers might enjoy. If any of the series I talked about here sound like they could make for interesting videos, just let me know in the comments and I can start to consider making some. In the meantime, hopefully I showed you some interesting new series to check out. If you want to stay updated on my next videos, make sure to subscribe and click the bell. You can also join the Hamon Discord to get notified on new uploads and any important JoJo news. Finally, I'd appreciate it if you help support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. By joining, you get your name at the end of the video and you can submit viewer questions. This video's question comes from Arios. They ask, since I mentioned being a One Piece fan, what are my favorite Paramecia, Zoan, and Logia fruits? Paramecia is definitely the hardest to choose from here since the powers are all so different, but I'd say the Ope Ope no Mi is my favorite for how versatile it is. For Zoan, I'd have to go with the Hito Hito no Mi since Chopper has by far the most interesting Zoan transformation. And for Logia, I choose the Pika Pika no Mi for belonging to Kizaru, who is one of my favorite characters. If you want to leave a question, you can join the Patreon or YouTube membership at any tier. On Patreon, you can leave it in the community chat, and on YouTube, you can leave it as a comment under the members-only community post. I try to answer one question per video, so feel free to leave as many questions as you want. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Sloth Dog, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Gatling Grove, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Big T, C Manga, Minty, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Jolene, Monticelli, Zenkai, Royal Slush, Keenan, Perry, Noland, John Braun, Cho Henshin, Saint Bobo, Max Verstappen, Kira Not Yoshikage, John Garcia, Love Second, Allegor, and Onyx.